I want to welcome our viewers to Kennesaw Happenings. We're in our studios in our individual places. I have John Powell on the line, and we're coming to you on Saturday mornings. So, not everybody is, our thousands of listeners are not. So, John, tell our viewers who you are, what you do, and who you serve.
Yeah, I'm John Powell. I'm a Kennesaw native. At least I would call myself a Kennesaw native. Grew up here, went to high school here in Kennesaw.
Mhm.
Then joined the military for 13 years active duty. Went all around the country and all around the world, doing that, and have come back to Kennesaw back in 2018, and am now an active real estate agent and investor, doing a lot of different things in the real estate space.
That's why we have you on. I love it. So tell us, I mean, so you traveled around the world. What countries did you go? What country did you go to that kind of not impressed you, but changed your belief about where you were? Was there anyone that sticks out in your mind?
I guess, yeah, both ends of the spectrum. Some of the third world countries, just realizing how blessed we are here in America.
Hmm.
The abundance that we have is definitely humbling. And then on the other end of the spectrum, super dense urban areas like Lima, Peru, where there's 14 million people in the size of Atlanta. Um, you know, that's really an eye changer as far as the density that can happen in areas.
Hmm. Yeah, I think anybody that travels to different countries, I always hear the first thing is we realize how blessed we are with all the things that we just kind of sometimes take for granted because even the fact running water is not common around the world. So, you get to see that different perspective. And the reason we talked earlier about, the changing landscape out there, meaning like right here in Kennesaw, lands being gobbled up by KSU, and there's different things that are happening because the availability of land is changing. So what do you see from your eyes, having traveled for 18 years and seen different countries, different situations? What could you say? Because the one topic that I was very interested in is tiny homes. And I
Mhm.
have seen the change in mindset. Matter of fact, Robert, who I wanted to have on, I saw him yesterday, and and I forgot the date, or I would have given him this date and he probably would be on with us. But he said, "Yep, I'm waiting still for the permit." And it's 8 months later, and he's building down in town, or not building, but placing a tiny home in the backyard of his daughters and son-in-law. So what do you see as we always changing the landscape? What do you see from your eyes, having seen the world and the densely populated areas? You come back to Kennesaw and you look at the changing landscape in Kennesaw. What do you see as far as opportunities to kind of change our belief systems about some of the things that we have always done, which we've always had plenty of land? It's a long question. I hopefully
Yeah,
you understand where I'm going.
yeah. I think one of the things that I've noticed in other countries is there's the density can be significantly denser than Kennesaw is, and still have a great society and all that. Another thing I noticed out in other countries is that many times families live together on the same compound or the same building, that type of thing, where our current zoning and the way we do things makes that extremely difficult in Kennesaw. Because I, like in my personal case, I have land here in Kennesaw, and I went to the city of Kennesaw and asked them, "Hey, can I build a second house on this 3 acres in the city limits?" And there's no way you can do it. The only way you can possibly add to your house is additional living space, is to connect the two, which
Mhm.
that could change the paradigm. But I know even in the US, there are places where you can do what's called an ADU, or a tiny house, to increase the density and allow, in some cases, families to live together, or older people to still maintain their house and have a younger person potentially renting out that space to help fund that lifestyle. But technically, by the code, City of Kennesaw doesn't allow that, which is a way to increase some density without necessarily building apartments, which has been kind of the sentiment of Kennesaw, which is understandably is the goal to increase density because that increases tax revenue.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm all for whatever the changing landscape gives us. Is you always hear you got to play the cards that are dealt you. I mean, the one thing that I have struggled with, and Robert, whether he can't be on right now, but he had a very narrow tiny home that wouldn't have fit. Like, you have the mother-in-law suites that you have to have the perfect attachment and the land that enables you to build that. But he was able to place a very narrow tiny home on a strip of property up in Detroit that really, that's the only way they were going to be able to put that home in. And I agree with you. The attachment has always been the mindset. Hey, if you can't attach it to your existing home, we're not going to give you a permit. But not every home is attachable. So what do you see, like, if we look at this a little differently, how do you see it from your eyes, the ability to place, and I love what you said, families together, because I was at Rotary this week, and the next president was talking about, she was from Nigeria, and they had communities, within communities, and it gave generations a chance to be together. Here in America, we're all over the place, so we don't have that. So just share with our viewers what you see, like, one, the challenges we have, and what you see. What would you like to see if you had the magic brush and you could kind of change everything? What would you like to see in Kennesaw?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, first off, is current zoning doesn't allow it. And to change that, you have to do a significant push and movement to get the city to change the zoning ordinances. And I think that ordinances are important because they lend some uniformity, so you don't have, all kind of, say, trailers parked in people's yards and people living in it and all that, which I've seen in some areas, in some countries, even in the US here, down in Florida, that's very common. You'll have $1 million house right next to a single wide trailer, which obviously zoning and ordinances are important to control that. However, there's no instrument currently for somebody who has, say, a paid for house and wants to remain in their home to build a in-law suite or a, garage apartment type thing, unless it's attached to the house, which, as a young guy, when I was first starting my family, I would have loved to have lived close to my parents, but not necessarily attached. So living on the same property might be nice, but just that attachment piece makes it very difficult. And on a smaller lot, you may not be able to do that reasonably. So I think that maybe looking at and instituting an ADU option would be a good idea. And like the tiny homes that are kind of mobile, if you will, you move them one time, kind of set them up and done. Allowing that in some classifications, I don't think that that's necessarily the answer for every single neighborhood, but maybe in the areas that are not zoned as neighborhoods per se, that are rural or more rural. I mean, there's not a lot of rural left in Kennesaw, but that would be an option to increase density without having to significantly increase infrastructure like some of the larger projects.
Yeah, it's so important as we change our beliefs to the changing tide of what's going on there. I was in an Uber. It was one of my first Uber rides years ago, and so I was talking to the lady, and I was like, "Hey, what why did you decide to drive?" And so she said, "Hey, I'm an empty nester, and I wanted to meet people. I wanted to just have some relationship building," is basically what she said. But she she had told me she was doing tiny homes up in Asheville. And, Asheville's is changed quite a bit. It's become
Mhm.
a very popular spot, and even to the point where um, Airbnbs were discouraged within the city limits because it was jeopardizing the hotel industry. And I think there's always a balance of how you evaluate how business can operate together, because everybody wants to protect their turf. That
Mhm.
the hotel industry wanted to keep charging $500 a night, and these people that had, small rooms to rent out, hey, they wanted to generate some revenue at $100 a night, whatever it is. But it takes cooperation or collaboration in thinking to really accomplish an end result. So I mean, you said something about, putting like a tiny home in the back of your parents' house, about home. What do you see as far as, like, how would that benefit the family by being not attached but close to your parents?
There's a couple different benefits. Like my parents are pretty involved in my kids' life. They pick them up from school occasionally. If I'm out of town, they'll take them to school, that type of stuff. So
Mhm.
obviously those functions without having to leave the house to get them to get the thing would be beneficial. One thing that I do see is the reduction in cars. My parents are, in their 70s. They've got a couple of cars. I've got a couple of cars. There's some overlap there that if we were living on the same property, we could reduce by a car or two
Mhm.
and still live a very functional lifestyle. So that would reduce some of the traffic and some of the um, need for that. And obviously, the economies of scale as far as finances and all that. If you're paying one electric bill, one internet bill, that can help with housing affordability, but not diminish the quality of life.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I just yesterday we had a expo here at Overture, and one of the gentlemen that was displaying, it was mainly healthcare people, but this guy was it was like a ride share. He was part of the DOT, and you know how, you have these bullet trains in different cities, and you're trying to be able to move people from A to B, but your infrastructure's already laid. I mean, it's not like you can tear up the
Mhm.
roads and put something in. But his approach, which I had never heard it, is incentivizing ride sharing. So if your ride to work is a predictable ride, it goes into a app that tells people where your commute is. So all of a sudden you go, "Hey, Joe, we go the same route. Let's share a car." And it incentivized the sharing part, because Kennesaw, and I live right by 41 and Ernest Barrett. If you try to go out on Ernest Barrett at 5 o'clock going south,
Mhm.
good luck. I mean, you can't even get out on the road, much less it's bumper to bumper.
Mhm.
So they're putting a bridge behind us, which will take some of the traffic off of that road and take it to Old 41. But it's those kind of things. There's more people trying to get to the same place, but creative solutions, I think, are so important. Have you ever heard of, and it's through the DOT, and his name was Aaron, and I'm going to have him on the podcast, but it was genius because it's almost like an Uber style thought process,
Mhm.
but cutting down on traffic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a benefit to everybody if you can reduce the number of vehicles and still get the same mobility accomplished. And that would be one of the benefits. If you have a coworker that's instead of just family living there, if you had a coworker that worked there, y'all could share a car and have one less car on the road every day, so that
Mhm.
you could have a benefit there. And the same thing goes for an apartment complex, right? If you have two or three people that work in the same office that live in a complex, they could absolutely ride share in that way as well. And it sounds like this is a piece that would facilitate that so people understand that, oh yeah, by the way, the guy 3 doors down I haven't met, but he happens to work at the same building I do downtown.
Yeah.
Let's reduce that number of cars on the road.
Yeah, and think of the conversations, you're by
Mhm.
yourself versus getting to know somebody that lives 3 doors down from you. I mean, that would be pretty cool to
Yeah.
me, is that I love, listening to podcasts and things, to educate myself in the car, but there's not a better way than educating by building a relationship with somebody that lives in a like apartment complex next to you. Well, I wanted to ask you this: 18 years in the military, when you transitioned out of the military, what was that like? Were you like, what do I do? How do I take my skill set that I learned in the military and take it into private sector?
So for me, it was a relatively easy transition. I'm actually still in the reserve, so I do like the 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year type thing
Hmm.
down at Dobbins. Um, but that transition was pretty easy because I knew what I wanted to do. Basically, I had always told my guys after my first re-enlistment, I told my guys, "Hey, make sure you make yourself better while you're here, so that when a re-enlistment comes up, you have to make a hard choice, but in a good way, meaning you have good opportunities outside and good opportunities in the military, and you have to make that hard choice." So after basically my first enlistment, I had a wife, 2 kids, no real skill set that was transferable to the outside. So I was stuck. I had to reenlist. Um, so I made it my point to have options. So by the time I got to that reenlistment at my 13-year mark, um, Kathy, my wife, was already pretty successful at real estate. I had had a couple of real estate investments that were relatively successful, and I
Hmm.
felt that transitioning back home and doing that full time would be beneficial. But there were definitely bumps in the road as far as going from a very linear income to a sporadic income where you go months without getting paid at times. Um,
Yeah.
so that
What
was
what
my
did
transition.
you what was it like? Because did you move around in the 18 years? I mean, that's probably a loaded question. I'm
Yeah, I mean,
sure
of
you.
course. We started out down in the Fort Walton Beach, Florida area, moved up to Little Rock, Arkansas, lived there for 7 years, and then moved back down to the Fort Walton Beach area, different base. But that was the family moving, and then my job was a load master flying the 130s you see, I guess here,
Mhm.
right there. Um, so I flew all over the world, probably 38 countries last time I counted it, maybe more than that now.
Wow.
So I traveled a ton and still do travel, at least once a year. I typically get to go on a trip somewhere, typically out of the country for 2 or 3 weeks to do that mission set. So,
Wow, that's not your typical path. At least I haven't seen.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's an interesting one, at least.
Yeah, very much. How did you manage, like Kathy, with, you're leaving an area and
Mhm.
you're like, okay, you have the family, you have, you know, all the things going on. How did she manage, like, the moving around and the change in environment? What was that like?
It was always difficult, and ultimately, that's what led me to leave active duty. Um, there were more, excuse me, there were inevitably going to be some more moves. And as the kids got older, it got harder and harder. A 3-year-old, 4-year-old, wherever their parents are, is home, right? But as you get into middle school and high school, you know, the children are forming their sense of identity, all that, and picking them up and moving them is very difficult. So we
Mhm.
decided that, hey, if I'm going to continue doing any of this military travel and all that, we need to have a strong, stable base, which is why we came back to home, because both her parents and my parents live in the, North Metro Atlanta area. So we're both within 5 miles of our parents,
Mhm.
which, lends itself to lots of support when I do travel.
Yeah, that's really so important. What was the educational challenges with your kids? I mean, because you're moving from school to school. There, did you homeschool? Did you use regular schools? What was that
Yeah,
like?
they were, while I was active, it was all regular schools.
Hmm.
And it was obviously Florida schools are very different than Arkansas schools. And so it was typically they're in military towns. So they're not alone in it because there's lots of kids whose parents just picked them up and moved them into the new school. So that wasn't, um, at the younger stages, wasn't terrible for them.
Right.
I think that if I'd had them in high school going through that, that would be pretty difficult for them, especially if it wasn't in a military town where other kids are doing the same thing.
Yeah, I think that what you said about being in a military town, they're familiar with their classmates are doing similar
Mhm.
things. You move to a city that is not dominated by a base.
Mhm.
I think it could be a bigger challenge because moving kids around is not easy. Change for anybody is not
Mhm.
easy. But, when you're smaller, it's a little bit more challenging. What do you think with all those changes? How do you think it prepared your kids versus somebody that maybe has lived in Kennesaw their whole life? Do you see a difference from your eyes?
Yeah, I think they have better adaptability and a little bit bigger perspective, right? They've lived in Arkansas where there's, you know, in areas there's significant poverty still. We've met people when we were in Arkansas who, like my age, who got running water for the first time in their lifetime, right? Like that's not really a Kennesaw, um, you know, in Metro Atlanta, that's not a thing, right?
Right.
And then obviously in Florida, you have the whole kind of beach lifestyle, the slower pace of living, et cetera. So
Mhm.
they've seen different things and they have a broader perspective than maybe somebody who's grown up and lived in the same, you know, county their whole life.
Right. What would you say back to? I would like to touch on real estate a little bit before we let you go. What are you seeing with the higher interest rates? The inventory's pretty low. What are you seeing like from your eyes in real estate you could share with our viewers that coming from your perspective is different than most?
Yeah, the higher interest rates have a large impact on, um, basically, or anybody under 40, for the most part, has a pretty big impact. Over 40, most people have built enough wealth or equity in their home that, yes, while they may pay a higher interest rate if they're going to get a mortgage, they can sustain that because they have a lot of equity to put down. So if you sell a, seven or $800,000 house and take away $500,000 in equity, you put that down on a new house. Yeah, you have 6 or 7% interest on, $250,000 is not going to kill you. Whereas your first time home buyers, it's really difficult for them, but they're still out there. They're still um, doing it. It's just not as easy as it was. Like back in the beginning of COVID, when we had really low interest rates, a young couple making $100,000 a year could buy $1 million house. Today, that same $100,000 income with no debt, you're looking at maybe 550. So it's really cut that buying power down for your first time home buyers and even your move up home buyers. Um, your guys and girls that are in my generation, family, all that, where we would typically move up into potentially a bigger house as our family expands and we need more. It's just not feasible. You're looking at tripling their monthly payment for their mortgage to move up incrementally. Um,
Mhm.
so they'll just stay where they're at and renovate or add on. And that's kind of the perspective.
Yeah, I read a stat the other day. It was a high percentage of homes are being bought by like the Blackstones. I think it's the Blackstones, but the big investment companies. I
Mhm.
guess they call it like real estate equity companies.
Mhm.
And so Georgia was like very high compared to the country, where I think it was 33%. I don't quote me on it, but it was a high percentage. What has that done to the inventory where big companies are buying homes like crazy and holding on to them and renting them out? What have you seen from your eyes?
Yeah, that's slowed down in the last year or so, but they're still buying. They're still, Basically they have an appetite, and I get calls every single day. Hey, I've got a big institutional buyer who wants, and their buy box is normally at sub $400,000, 3-bed, 2-bath. Basically your first time home buyer type house, that's what they buy. So it's disproportionately impacting people who would be first time home buyers, because that price is getting driven up, and their rents are getting driven up by the big institutions who are pushing rents. And I mean, obviously the smaller investors are following suit, because if that's the market rent, you charge the market rent if you want to sustain your business.
Right.
And yeah, it's impacting even your current homeowners, because it's pushed the prices up so much, and their taxes are going up. I'm having guys call me and say, hey, my taxes went up $500 a year or a month this year, which is for, is pretty significant on somebody who has a $1,500 mortgage that goes to $2,000. That's pretty significant.
That, I don't think we always take into consideration when the tax value of a property goes significantly up, it affects, your bottom line of what your spending is. I mean, if you're a family looking at $1,500 and the light switch goes on and now it's $2,000, you got to figure out where that $500 is going to come from. So I can see that would be definitely a challenge. What would you say, have you seen, I've talked to some of these apartment owners, and they said, the younger people, they don't see the buy the home, first home as the first option, because I think what you just said, the first time buyer, it's so expensive for that first time buyer. And so they're getting into more apartments and having that flexibility. Have you seen similar things that, the younger people are not saying, I want to buy that first home because it may be very, very expensive?
I don't see it. I'm isolated from that, right? Because I deal with people who are looking to buy a home. So I don't really typically, I'm not interacting with people who are happy living in their apartment. It's just not the demographic that comes to me looking to buy a home. Because the ones who come to me are done living that lifestyle and want to have the home with the yard and all those, typical American dream type things. But it is becoming more difficult, and I'm seeing a change in the age demographic that's coming. Like your first time home buyers now are mid-30s. I used to see them in their early 20s, get out of college, get their first job, and they'd be buying a house. Those people still are out there. I did one for a nurse and an engineer the other day, and they were able to buy a nice home in Woodstock, and it still happens. But your blue collar workers who are just starting out, it's not an option. It's just not, unless they have family help.
Yeah. That makes it. I want to be respectful of your time, because I know Saturday morning with the kids is a challenge. So let's tell our viewers, and I'll put it up on the screen, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, I mean, you got it up on the screen there. My email, john@herchomes.com, or you can look up our website. You can look at homes there, that type of stuff. We do Airbnbs. I do spec built mobile homes up in Gilmer County, as well as a couple of spec built homes up there. We're starting that project now. But if you're looking to buy or sell or even invest, I do a lot of investment for other people as well as for myself in real estate. So reach out, give me a call. You see my number up there in the upper left-hand corner of that website is 404-788-5748.
Awesome. You mentioned, was it Gilbert County? Is that
Gilmer, Ellijay area?
Okay.
So if you're familiar with that, up there we do the, basically very similar to the tiny house that you're talking about. It's moved in, put on a permanent foundation, and at the end of the day, it's FHA, VA, and USDA financeable. Turnkey, brand new product. Yeah,
when it was 38 years and moving to Kennesaw, I ended up buying a piece of property up in LJ because it was attached to a golf course, but it was not a buildable lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of that up there.
Yeah. And it was basically, I just bought it just to be a member of the golf course. And then fast forward a few 10 years, I going, well, I'm, family's starting. I might be heading up to LJ every Saturday like I was doing. So I ended up selling the piece of property, but it was not I forget what you call when you can't build on a piece of property. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like it doesn't perk or something. I don't remember.
Oh yeah, if it doesn't perk, that makes it difficult. That means that you couldn't put a septic tank on the lot. That's
Okay.
Effectively a useless lot for the purpose of building a home.
Yeah.
Adding to your acreage if you have the adjacent lot is really the only good use of it. So yeah, it's an interesting thing because we buy those little lots, and almost all of them we get from people who, hey, I owned it for 10 years, paid taxes on it, paid the HOA fee on it for 10 years, never used it once. I mean, they, like in your case, at least you were getting the benefit of the golf membership, but a lot of these are just paying to maintain the neighborhood that they're never using.
Yeah, it was like, I went and looked at it one time. It was a big old rock. I mean, you couldn't have built anything on it. You couldn't have put a bathroom on that, that thing. It was so small, but that you had to be a landowner to be a part of the golf course. So yeah, I guess that was enough.
I like that business model.
What's that?
I like the business model. I mean, just sell useless pieces of land to people who want to play golf.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And when I sold it to a friend, it was like, well, you can play golf up there, and don't look to camp out on the piece of land because there's not enough room to do that, and it's not level enough to put even a 2x4 on it. But okay, well, I want to thank you, John, for taking out your time on Saturday morning to be with us, and just encourage our viewers, if you want somebody with John's skill set and you're looking for a dream home, whether it's a small, tiny home or a home up in LJ, get a hold of him. You can get a hold of him on the information on the screen. And if you have any questions for John, certainly post them, and it'll be available to him to answer your question. So thanks so much, John. We appreciate you spending your Saturday morning with us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pete.
You bet.